Presently, millions of black people now reveres our oppressors and perceives ourselves as being our own worst enemies, in spite of a brutally horrific history of the contrary. This noted mindset among black people that clearly benefits to white society is far too widespread to be coincidental. It's not. It's never coincidental whenever the oppressed starts thinking exactly as their oppressors wants them to think. It's always by deliberate design whenever this happens. The collective progressions of millions of black people have been deliberately shifted away from the white oppressive society and has been redirected against ourselves. And it has absolutely nothing to do with a silly slave syndrome myth. That silly myth presents what would in fact be the least effective method used for controlling generations of millions of people. It's absolutely not how true brainwashing is achieved. True brainwashing requires a system that is being constantly reinforced and reapplied upon the minds of a targeted population in order to remain effective. Don't reject facts in order to hold on to a silly slave syndrome myth. Doing so will keep you ignorant and mentally enslaved by your oppressors. To reverse engineer what has been done to our people, what has been done to us, we must gain a clear, concise, and accurate understanding of what was actually done to us. Because if our understandings of our collective condition are flawed, then all of our liberating strategies and remedies that stems from those misunderstandings will also be flawed. This is why those of us who know the truth must teach. African proverb. The truth does matter. In order to free our minds, the truth of our plight and collective condition is that black people have been deliberately socialized by the white society. Socialized is when the oppressors exploit their monopoly over information that are fed into the collective minds of the oppressed by feeding the oppressed disinformation that manipulates the oppressed to think and behave in ways that are beneficial to all oppressors. More specifically, it's when the oppressors manipulates the minds of the oppressed to think in ways that are against our own self-interest and instead in ways that serves and protects the interests of the oppressors. The socializing of the oppressed is possible because regardless of how intelligent people are, if it's possible to control the input of information that people receive, it's entirely possible to control what people will believe and even how they'll behave. This is because people's behaviors align with the information that they receive and have accepted. This is precisely what white oppressive forces have done to the black population. Through the white society's monopoly over information that we receive, they've socialized millions of black people to think in ways that benefits the white society. White social scientists describe this nefarious practice as merely instilling a value system into the collective minds of black people that makes us more compliant with white dominance over our lives. This is the truth of our plight and condition. It's how white oppressive forces protects their white nations from massive unified black retribution. The African slaves of the 21st century are those who cannot overcome their socialized minds. If you don't believe that white oppressive forces would exploit their monopoly over information that we receive by feeding us false information that makes us think and behave in ways that benefits themselves, you are extremely naive. Furthermore, you don't know true history. Throughout history, those empires that were brutally oppressive, fearing eventual acts of massive retribution from the oppressed, have always prevented it by socializing the minds of the oppressed to think in ways that prevents the oppressed from unifying and seeking retribution against their oppressors. Therefore, the beliefs and perceptions held by the oppressed are never truly their own. They're always falsehoods beneficial to the oppressors that were deliberately embedded into the minds of the oppressed by their oppressors without the oppressed even realizing it. This is the case with us. We have been socialized to think in ways benefiting the white society. It's the true reason why millions of black people now perceive ourselves as being our own worst enemies and reveres our oppressors in spite of such a brutally horrific history of the contrary. Here's the reason why the socializing of black people is deemed necessary from the perspective of the white society. While the white oppressors, through their weaponry advantages of guns and cannons, could brutally invade and enslave Africans, they, however, cannot win our loyalty or sustain peace with us indefinitely unless our minds have been socialized to prevent us from unifying and seeking retribution against the oppressed. Because whenever people are oppressed for long durations, their collective aggressions against their oppressors will continue to grow until acts of retribution becomes inevitable. The oppressed always eventually rebels. This is an inherent response within the collective human psyche whenever people have been oppressed for long durations. To prevent these pending acts of rebellion and massive retribution, the oppressed must be socialized. This is what white oppressive forces have done to black people. Again, more specifically, white social scientists describes the hidden nefarious practice as merely instilling a value system into the collective minds of the black population that makes us adhere to the ruling authority of the dominant society and adhere to the infrastructure of the dominant society. It's how white oppressive forces protects their white nations from massive black retribution. Black people have also been trauma bonded to the white society. Black people are within a trauma-bonded, abusive relationship with a narcissistic white society. And just like within most trauma-bonded, abusive relationships, they've convinced many black people to believe that their mistreatments of us is our own fault. It's a psychological mind hack. Usually the term trauma-bonded refers to a gaslighting mental abuse that occurs within personal abusive relationships, in which one partner is manipulated and mentally abused by a narcissistic partner. Within that scenario, after repeatedly brutalizing the victim, the narcissistic abusive partner never acknowledges any of his wrongdoing. He instead minimizes the abuse and tells his victim that the abuse wasn't that bad, so just shut up and get over it. Get over it. That's what he does. He then constantly inundates the victim with demoralizing, disapproving narratives about the victim. This is continued until the victim stops focusing on the abuse that he received and instead focuses on the demoralizing, disapproving narrative. This focus causes the abused victim to, rather than resenting the abuser, he or she seeks the approval of the abuser. This trauma-bonded effect provides the abuser with a more favorable outcome from the victim rather than having the victims hating and resenting him for the abuse. The human mind is easily manipulated when the victim is unaware of what's being done to his mind. It's a well-proven gaslighting tactic. Likewise, that same trauma-bonding, abusive manipulation tactic is what the white social engineering scientists and white propagandists have done to the black masses. After brutalizing black people for many centuries, the white society never acknowledged any of the horrible wrongdoing they did to black people. They instead minimized it, marginalized it, and insist that the abuse wasn't that bad. And they tell black people to just shut up and get over it. They then constantly inundate black people with black racially demoralizing, disapproving propaganda narratives about ourselves. Therefore, rather than resenting the white society for their brutal mistreatment of us throughout many centuries, many of us instead tries to win their approval. Many black people go out of their way to try to show white people that we're not all bad. Black people are within an abusive relationship with a narcissistic white society. And just like within most abusive relationship, they've convinced many black people to believe that their mistreatments of us was our own fault. It's a gaslighting psychological warfare mind hack. The minds of targeted populations are quite easy to manipulate if people are unaware of what's being done to them. Once minds have been confused, manipulation becomes simple. The mind will even ignore common sense, and rationality falls away, even overlooking hypocrisy and deception. Now you know the truth of our plight and condition. It has nothing to do with biblical fairy tale written by our most ungodliest enemies. It has nothing to do with silly slave syndrome myth. These are all social sciences that the white society deploys against us. The white society exploits its monopoly over information that we receive to create a psychological prison for our minds. This is the reality we must face. We must recognize it and then develop counter strategies to overcome it. One love and peace.